Hello and welcome to the Robotics channel on YouTube. My name is Professor Tracy Harwood. I am Professor of Digital Culture at De Montfort University, and today I'm joined by Professor Marc Hanheide and Mike Wilson. I'm going to hand you straight over to Marc to talk about why we're here today.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, and a very warm welcome to Mike. So my name is Marc Hanheide. I'm a professor of intelligent robotics and interactive systems at the University of Lincoln. And I'm super excited that we've got Mike Wilson here today, who has got a long track record in robotics and automation, is currently the Chief Automation Officer at the MTC, the Manufacturing Technology Center at Coventry, and has previously worked at ABB and KUKA, and is also the vice chair of BARA. I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, Mike, you shall correct me, which is the British Automation and Robot Association. We've invited Mike here to talk a little bit more about the challenges, the prospects, and the immediate issues we have probably in automation in industry and manufacturing when it comes to cobots. So we're talking about collaborative robots and their opportunities and challenges. Mike, I'm going to go straight in, if I may. So, can you tell us a little bit what is the difference between classical automation and robotics and cobots?
In simple terms, it's effectively a cobot is designed in a way that it can work alongside people. As you probably know, traditional industrial robots are always surrounded by 2-meter high guards, and the systems are designed to keep the people away from the robot. Whereas with cobots, you can actually work alongside the robot in the same area, sharing the same space.
So is it then mostly an opportunity of getting rid of those fences and reducing the investment that's required, or what are the other opportunities?
Well, I mean, to be fair, the cobot's designed so it can work alongside people by a couple of particular points. Firstly, if it does come into contact with the person, it will stop. It'll sense that contact and it will stop. But they're also limited in terms of their payload and their speed of operation, because you obviously can't work fast carrying heavy loads when you're working adjacent to people. So they're not applicable to all applications, which is very important to note. But what they do, they do allow more flexible installations, because you can potentially, without the safety guarding, you can put the robot in and then move it around the facility much more easily. They also are potentially lower cost, because you don't necessarily have to invest in the same safety equipment. And as they've developed, they become easier to program than industrial robots. They've got less capability, but they're potentially easier to set up, install, and get running. So they're much easier for new users to actually implement as an automation solution.
So that's interesting. If I now think about it as a sort of, you mentioned it's probably an easier route into automation. Is that how they are currently being used in the sector?
I think in the main they're making automation robotics more accessible to SMEs. So to some extent, yes is the answer to your question. Mm-hmm. But what you do need to be aware of, because they carry less load and because they're slower, they're not always the right answer to a particular automation problem. And it is about finding the right application for a cobot to make sure that you get the best value out of that investment. But it does make it easier for particularly SMEs to make their first step into this kind of technology.
So what are good applications then? I think that's the big challenge and the big question that we always see, because often we see well, if you do automation, you do it to increase productivity, to, in the end, address problems of having enough labor to work in these areas. So what are the good applications? What are cobots being used right now for, and what are potential future applications?
Well, I think you've got to start that question really by looking at why you're going to automate in the first place. And to me, it's all about using the automation for the dirty, the dangerous, the demanding jobs, the mundane, the repetitive tasks, the kind of jobs that people shouldn't really be doing anymore. And certainly in the UK at the moment, we have a labour shortage. So it is about automating those repetitive, mundane tasks and using the people where they're going to add value to the product. So what we're really looking for is all those kind of repetitive, simple tasks where people aren't adding any value to the product. And that often is literally just moving things around. It might be loading a machine tool and unloading it. It might be putting boxes on a pallet. It might be moving things from a particular fixed station onto a conveyor. All those kind of pick and place type applications are all readily automated, and often a cobot is a good answer for those kinds of applications. What we are starting to see is increasing numbers of cobots being used in those simple pick and place activities, because it's relatively low cost, it's relatively easy to implement, and the return on investment is often quite quick. And as I said, it then means that the people that you've currently got literally just picking things up and moving them around could be doing something much more value add. In terms of the future, we are starting to see cobots being applied for a whole range of different applications. So welding, for example, and they're principally being applied for welding because they're easier to program, but they're not as capable as an industrial robot in that particular case. So you have to pick the right kind of applications that you're going to try and implement using a cobot. But again, it's often the very repetitive. It might be welding small brackets, for example. And if you've got a limited number of welders and part of your activity means that you need to weld thousands of small brackets, well, why not get a cobot to do that and use your welders to actually weld the one-offs, the more complicated parts, where their skills are actually useful in terms of producing the product, and it gives the workers better tasks to undertake anyway. So I think we are starting to see increasing numbers of cobots being applied, certainly in all the pick and place machine tending applications, but we're starting to see more into things like welding, into palletizing, generally simple applications that are relatively easy to automate.
Mm-hmm. What I found interesting, all you've said, and this is probably coming from a naive academic background here, but all of you, what you've said is basically still not really what I would consider collaborative tasks, right? This is where the robots is doing some part, and it's safer for them to be near humans and do this in a smaller scale, smaller floor footprint, if you want. But is there also opportunities to really work closely together, where I would say, like, we're manufacturing something where the robot is taking one role and the human is taking another role, but actually working together on the same piece?
And yes is the simple answer to that, but it's much less frequent.
Yeah.
So for example, ABB developed the two-arm Yumi collaborative robot, which is designed to undertake assembly type tasks, and the principle behind that is you could have the operator performing some of the assembly tasks where the particular skills he may have with his eyes, with his fingers, touch sensing and so on, can actually implement that more easily and use the robot for the repetitive part of the assembly task. And you could easily have the operator sitting alongside the robot, passing the parts onto the robot for it to perform its operations. There are different levels of collaboration, if you like, where most applications, as you rightly say, Mark, we have the robot working without guarding, but it's operating separately from the operator. At the higher level, you can have the robots and the people actually working on the same part at the same time. But that isn't, I can't think of any examples where I've seen that being done. And it's partly down to safety, and it's partly down to complexity, because we may know exactly what the robot's going to do, but we don't necessarily know exactly what the person's going to do. People are not necessarily repetitive in the same way that robots are. So it's potentially difficult to have them working literally cooperatively on the same part at the same time. But and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, we want to make the most of both both groups, as it were. We want the people to do what they're good at. We want the robots to do what they're good at, and that doesn't necessarily mean making the people work like robots. It's about using the best of their skill sets, if you like, to achieve the end goal of a productive manufacturing facility.
Mm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, yeah, sorry, Tracy.
Well, I was going to say, I've got a very quick question. I was going to ask, how are the co-robotics shapes and forms evolving, given what you've just said there?
Most cobots are, I'm trying to think, the easiest way of describing it, 6-axis articulated arm.
Yes.
So they're not far off an arm of a human, if you like, and that is by far the most prevalent robot design. There are certain other designs. There's a Delta type design that's been used for high-speed pick and packing kind of applications, but most of those are not cobots at this point in time, principally because you want those high-speed pickers to be operating literally at high speeds, and therefore they're not safe to have people within the same vicinity. So as I said, most cobots are 1 or 2 arm 6-axis devices that look very similar to a human arm. And I think, to be fair, across all types of robots, probably something like 80% of all of them are all of that shape, all of that form. So it has become by far the most prevalent. I don't think anybody's particularly developing cobot devices of other shapes and sizes at the moment, purely because it's still a fledgling market, and there are still lots and lots of applications that can be satisfied by the existing designs.
Mm. And are exoskeletons also classified as co-robotics?
I don't think so. I wouldn't count those. They're certainly an aid to workers, and they're certainly within the domain, if you like, of the robots and autonomous devices technologies. But I wouldn't cast them as robots because they haven't got motion inherent within themselves. They need a person to actually undertake the motion.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So what I found interesting, what you said there about the really collaboration between humans and robots in these tasks, and that there is probably something that you said, I think you don't want to make the humans robots. I think that's pretty much paraphrasing what you just said. So is there a dedicated training need for humans to be actually able to work best with robots? Is that addressed? Is that something that we need to also consider as we move towards more of a hybrid working environment in manufacturing with robots and humans working together? I'm coming from a sort of, again, academic background where I know there have been some studies, and very quickly when you talk to real workers, they find the ways to cheat the robot or blame the robots in these sort of settings. For instance, when something isn't quite working, they don't achieve their piece rate, for instance, and it's often quite easily identifiable that it's the robot, right, that is to be blamed for that potentially. So is there a need? How can we actually move towards something where we have this synergy between robots and humans and make the best out of them?
I think there are a number of different levels to that question. From a training perspective, obviously the people that are designing and installing the solutions need to have a certain level of training, understanding what the machines can do, how to program them, how to set them up. The people that are maintaining them likewise need knowledge and need training. The workers that are going to work alongside the robots, that's slightly different. And I think that to me is much more about acceptance. So it's much more about involving the workers early on in the conversation about the introduction of the robots. And to be fair, this is as true of industrial robots as it is of cobots. To install a piece of automation successfully, you need to understand exactly what the task is that the automation is going to perform. And the people that know that are the workers that are doing those tasks today. And therefore, it's very important to get a successful installation that you understand from them what it is they're actually doing. It's also, as you rightly pointed out, Mark, important that they buy into it as a step forward, because if they support it, then the automation will work. If they don't support it, then there is a risk that it will fail. If we can get their buy-in to the introduction of the automation, then they will support it, and we stand more chance of success. And to get their buy-in, I think a lot of the time it's involving them early. It's explaining what it is that's trying to be achieved, and also giving them reassurance that it's not about replacing their jobs. It's about replacing some of the tasks that they're undertaking and giving them more opportunity to move to higher value add tasks, which might become programmer, for example. It might be the person that's doing the maintenance, or it might be something else within the facility. Very few companies that actually introduce robots, cobots, actually make people redundant as a result of that introduction. They become more productive, they become more competitive, and then they hire more people. So it is about ensuring that the workforce understands the direction of travel, what you're trying to do, and supports that.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Question to add to that then. How do you get legacy, factories that work with legacy equipment to buy into this then?
As in, existing machine tools or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
It doesn't, you don't have to replace the existing equipment. You can often add the robots, the cobots, to the existing facilities. And to some extent, that's one of the benefits of cobots, because within existing facilities, there may not be much space available. They're designed around the machinery that you've got and the people that you've got, and you may want to try and fit a robot or a cobot into a certain piece of space, and if you put a robot in with all its safety guarding around it, that may well then restrict access to that space. It may make the whole operation of that production area infeasible. Whereas if we put a cobot in there that does allow people access into the same space, that may enable the automation. So there are quite a few applications where there's existing machinery and people have wanted to put a piece of automation in to undertake part of the task, and they've used a cobot to do that because it's just more readily installed.
And what new skills might you need in the factory environment to take advantage of adding some level of automation in there into the business, basically?
I think, again, I think there are two levels there. One is some basic training about how to operate, install, operate, and maintain the equipment. But none of that is particularly complicated. It is relatively easily taught, and often it is taught to the existing people on the shop floor. I think the other issue is more about management attitudes, if you like, and business justification. It's about people understanding what the benefits of the cobots might be, understanding how to make the business case to justify it to their financial directors or their MDs. So that's not necessarily an issue particularly about robots, but it is literally just an issue about things like project management, business case development, and so on. And I think a lot of businesses do struggle with those kind of softer skills, as well as how to work with the workforce to implement these kind of technologies. So I think the softer skills are often more of a challenge because they're more difficult to teach than maybe the technical skills that you required to operate and maintain the equipment.
And what advice have you got for people in thinking about how to develop those skills?
Well, I think it's all about really engaging with independent advice. So as the Manufacturing Technology Centre, we certainly provide independent, technology agnostic advice to clients. And what we would typically do is we would take people through what we would call the automation journey, the key steps that are required to successfully implement a solution. But we're doing that in a way that we're educating the client at the same time. We're not doing it completely independently. We're working with them so they learn how to go about putting a business case together, how to select the right application, and so on. And we will do that with them. And what we're hopeful is that by the second time they need much less help, and by the third time they can do it on their own. And so it's more of a, if you like, learning by doing rather than a go away on a course and try to understand it. But there is some training available, and we do provide some training to give people an insight as to the kind of steps they ought to go through, things that they should look at for business case and so on.
And how are the financial institutions adapting to the increased demand by businesses for using these kinds of technologies?
That's one of the areas where there are some challenges in the UK. If it's capital investment, then they're reasonably well set up to deal with it. But there's an increasing interest in things like lease or asset based purchasing kind of options. And the financial institutions are not all completely set up to handle particularly robots, and they struggle in terms of things like residual value. And it's not really that applicable in this kind of case. So there are people buying forklift trucks, if you like, on lease programs. Cars are done that way. Machine tools are done that way, but there's not many robots done that way. And I think if we can change that dynamic, that will make it much easier for businesses to implement automation solutions.
That's a really interesting side of it, of course, because you're talking about massive scale investment to go fully automated, alongside, huge investment in training. For what ultimate benefit? Because the implications, of course, are also in terms of how you manage your supply chain as well, and whether or not that is capable then of meeting whatever increased demand you've got. Can you add any further thoughts on that side of things?
I think, to be fair though, Tracy, I'm going to disagree with you slightly, but
Great.
it doesn't have to be massive investment.
Okay.
And I think that's the important point. It isn't often about trying to automate the whole facility. It is literally about putting in one cobot to undertake a particular task, and then having succeeded with that, then look at the next one and build it up over time. And the installation of one cobot might be less than the cost of a car.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not talking enormous sums of money here. And I think there are a lot of people do perceive that it's very expensive. They do perceive that it's difficult to do, and it's really not as expensive and not as difficult as it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Well, that's great to know. Thank you very much.
So your consensus here is basically that Cobots provides like a stepping stone on this journey to automation for SMEs, and it's a way to start introducing automation without going big bang and building everything from scratch, right? That's I think that's the key.
Yeah, exactly. And learning as you go. And one of the key elements is always, and we always recommend this, it isn't for the first installation, it's not necessarily about the best return on investment. It's not about finding the biggest challenge in the factory. It's about finding an application that gives you a reasonable return, but is not too difficult, because there is a learning curve. And it's important that you go up that learning curve and you succeed on the first one, because if you succeed on the first one, you'll do more. If you fail on the first one, that's where you'll stop. So we always encourage people to pick relatively simple applications to start with.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to ask one thing for our probably more academic audience here. What is the big open challenge from a kind of research perspective? What is the capabilities that our cobots these days are still lacking that we really need to investigate further and see whether we can make some progress on?
I think it's probably in two areas. Firstly, it's about, I'm going to use the word intelligence. That may not be exactly the right word, but it is about the capability of these devices. So things like vision, sensors, and the ability to interpret that information to guide the robot, if you like. But doing that in a way that makes the programming of it and the understanding of it very simple. So it's not about throwing lots of clever technology at the device and then expecting the users to be able to program that and deal with that. It needs to have all those enhanced capabilities, but presented in a way that the user doesn't need a big training course on how to program it. And it's a little bit, I guess it's a bit like our mobile phones, because we don't get instruction manuals with our mobile phones. We're just expected to figure out how to do it. And we should be at that with cobots, even if they've got vision. And so artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of those kind of technologies are certainly pushing us forward in terms of making the machines more intelligent, but at the same time easier to use. And I think the other element where we certainly need work is in the grippers and the tools on the end of the cobots, because ultimately, the cobot itself does nothing. It needs some kind of tool on the end of it. And as you know, Mark, from your background, if we're starting to look at cobots being used in agriculture type applications or food type applications, it's how do you handle those sensitive objects? How do we pick them up without damaging them? So there's certainly a lot of work required in that area as well.
Thank you, Mike. I think we're coming to the end of our time here. I want to give you the opportunity to also address our more commercially, industrially inclined audience. What's the key message for them?
Well, I think certainly in the UK, there's lots of opportunities. We are behind what the rest of the world is doing. So on the league table of robot installations, which is based on robot density, so it's the number of robots per 10,000 workers. So it is a relative measure. We're currently 24th on that table, and our adoption rate is below the world average. We're out of step with what the rest of the world is doing. If we want our industries to be competitive going forward, we need to increase the adoption of robot automation, whether it's cobots or industrial robots. And given the current issues we have in terms of labor availability, we're certainly starting to see that increase. But I think fundamentally it's about people not being fearful of the technologies, people going to find out. And if they're uncertain, then come and talk to independent organizations, talk to yourselves, talk to us, get some advice in terms of how best to do it. There is significant potential. It will be a growing market for the next quite a few years. So I do expect to see quite a lot of exciting developments in this area over the next 5 years.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Tracy, any last words?
Well, I was just thinking, if we're going to climb back up that table, then obviously we need to be investing more in our manufacturing industries. And obviously this is going to be one of the key technologies that helps us address some of the gaps that we have at the moment. So it seems to me that the infrastructure that is beginning to evolve it probably needs a bit more of a marketing kick in order to at least raise awareness among the SME industries that we have and the ecosystems that we have in the UK, to bring the technologies to the attention of those business managers and also the financial institutions that are supporting them as well. So that would be my observation, I think, on it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and particularly thanks for Mike for having the time to be with us today.
Thanks very much.